Thank you very much, Katja, and for the nice introduction, which does connect well with what I'm going to say, I think. And thank you to the conference organisers for the invitation. I've been in Copenhagen since early April, and obviously I haven't managed to learn Danish in that time, but the talk I'm going to give today is kind of Danish in the sense that it has been done, the work has been done in Copenhagen. My colleagues at the ITU may be wondering what is Adrian doing in his office all the time. This is largely what I've been doing. So in that sense, I do feel it's part of Danish STS, even if just I'm only here temporarily. And like the other, well, the chair and the conference conveners have said, I'm really pleased to be part of the program. The program is a great program, and I hope that what I'm going to say connects to the things that you're working on. I can see some connections. I should do that as well, should I? Okay. Right, actually when I started in early April, there were 192 million events I was going to be looking at, but since then there's been another 20 million, so now it's 207, so it's going to be slightly harder. The paper concerns what Helen Veran has called practical going on with numbers. And in this case, it's about the kind of work we might do in order to get digital data, and particularly large numbers, to do something other than confirm what we already know. As Katja said, the work has a kind of an ethnographic ambition. That is, the ethnographic setting for this work is not a field site, but principally a stream of data, time-stamped event data, in this case from a social media platform. And the question is, can we treat a body of data, a data stream, ethnographically, as a kind of site? That is, can we find ways of inhabiting that data, finding places to sit in relation to that data, learn ways of having conversations with the data stream, and also include in our writing, our ethnographic kind of writing, the experience of being located in the data. How might a deliberate, and perhaps somewhat naive kind of work with numbers and data not only be informative about what's happening with devices and technologies, but also afford the possibility of momentary apprehensions of depth? It's a phrase I borrowed from Annalise Riles. Thank you, Christopher, who lent me the book. So it's about making numbers, the kind of work needed to do to make numbers work. So I want to show you some of the data stream. You can see this in any web browser, the URL's up there. These are the inscriptions of the events. They're detailed and they're heavily formatted. With formats is something that I'm really trying to focus on quite a lot here. We can see that it's quite a complex format. This is a watch event, so there's a whole set of different kinds of events in this data stream I'm looking at. And I won't read through the event in detail, but you can see that in these few dozen lines, there's some bits that describe organizations, some bits that are names, some bits that are links, pointing to images or other URLs. And this is a watch event, which is one of the simplest kinds of events in the data stream that I'm looking at. It's an event that occurs when someone says, I want to follow what's happening on this site. There are much more complicated event structures, which start to get harder to look at. For instance, this event structure, which is an issue comment event, is hard to show on a slide. Those last three screens are all part of one event. of this one issue comment event, which is about someone making a comment on an issue on the platform. So I'm not going to look at this in any detail. Instead of 24 lines, there's a couple of hundred lines here for one event. These events are hard to read. So if there are hundreds of millions of such events, 210 million roughly in the case I'm looking at, what kind of event, what kind of work can we do? What kind of ways of inhabiting these piles of inscription can we imagine? Well, in STS, there's been a lot of work on scale and complexity, large technical systems. You can think of the work of Hughes, or actor network theory has addressed issues of scale. In the social construction of technology literature, like Pinch and Biker and Collins, issues of scale are there. So there's quite a lot of work in STS, but much of that work doesn't work directly with things like data formats. It instead works with ethnographies of the sites, like the laboratories or the companies or the technical systems. The question I'm asking here, and it's echoed in other recent work in STS, is what kind of work can you do within the formatted data? In order to get the kind of momentary apprehensions of depth, the kind of double vision effects that ethnographic work can sometimes give rise to. Well, I've got, I guess, one way of talking about that comes from Noortje Mares and Walter Freder's recent work on liveness in methods. And as you can see from the quotes I've put up there, their suggestion is that we should work between the formatting of the data and the kind of objective analysis, which might be some social practice. We should look at the tensions between the way in which the data is formatted and the social processes which pass through and sometimes overflow the formatting of the data. We should look at the device-specific formatting of the data, as well as what overflows the formatting of the data. And that's the approach I think I'm trying to pursue here. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the actual data stream and its events, well, the platform it comes from. My case study is, you might have already seen it in the data, is a particular social media platform for software development called GitHub. It claims to be the largest code repository on the planet. I'm not sure whether you can read the text there, but it has, what's on this platform, repositories, code repositories, millions of code repositories where people work together on making bits of software of many different kinds. They do some other things apart from software. I'm not going to talk about those too much. There's a lot we could say about the social media platforms like GitHub in terms of the way they work as platforms, the kinds of funding, the software cultures that they're associated with, the practices of collaboration or cooperation, and so on. The main thing I want to talk about is the way that GitHub itself works with its massive data stream. Well, one thing it does is obviously offer numbers, and I have already invoked some of those numbers. For instance, GitHub claims there are 6.1 million people and it has 13.2 million repositories. So these numbers suggest kind of enormous activity around software and coding, and they do other things as well. They begin to tell stories about the centrality of the platform, it being a hub. It's a hub for software development, and these numbers kind of mirror GitHub's story about its centrality. That's one thing they do, give these big numbers. One way they work with the data stream is to just count make counts of large aggregates in it. 13.2 million repositories, 6 million people. Another thing they do with their data stream is select kind of exemplars from it, representative examples, or what they call showcases. And they have dozens of kind of exemplary projects or repositories on the platform that they use to tell stories about why GitHub is so important, why it's the biggest code repository on the planet. And then the final thing that the platform itself does from its data stream is provide a lot of visual kind of data analysis of individual repositories. So they move, here is the graphic for just one repository which shows who contributed what over what time, and there's various different kind of graphics that you can look at that show activity on one repository. So in terms of our ethnographic interest in the data stream, we have kind of different levels of story. On the one hand, an overall count story, which is about 30 million repositories, 6 million people, 200 million events. Then there's another level which is showcases, which is, I think, are not really drawn from the data stream. They're just publicly visible or exemplary repositories that are highlighted by the social media platform in order to publicize itself. And then finally, this very fine-grained individual kind of data graphics that show patterns of activity, work, contribution around particular repositories. So the question is, does the data stream afford any other kind of movement or any other kind of position which is somewhere other than the global counts, which are kind of flat and shallow, or the very fine-grained and perhaps deep individual traces of actions? Are there other places to be? It was implicit in what I showed you earlier when I showed you the event, the data stream, that the data stream is published. The publication of the data stream is something we shouldn't take for granted. It's a common feature of many kind of technological systems or code-based systems today that they publish data. They publish it for various reasons. Sometimes they publish it so that other people will do things that enhance the platform, build new applications with it. Sometimes they do it to augment or mirror the platform in various ways. So the publication of the data, I think, is a really significant, publication of the data stream is a significant feature of the material here. What happens when the data stream is published? Well, one thing people do in response to the publication of the data stream is to begin to archive it. So publication feeds into archives then. And here, the GitHub archive, which is not part of the GitHub platform, it's independent of that, archives all the data from GitHub. And I think this too is common with social media platforms. Again, the ambitions to archive this data are kind of explicit. The ambition is to archive it and make it easily accessible for further analysis. So in a sense, the data stream here is being offered in an archival form in order to afford analysis, and that presumably would include us. But in archiving the data stream, the format already begins to change. And I want to remind you that I'm talking, along with Morris and Weltfrader's work, about the need to do work on formatting. When the data is archived, the format changes in some ways. So the data is archived on GitHub Archive, but it's not surprising that it's also then reformatted on other platforms and devices. In this case, a Google cloud computing service called BigQuery. So all of the GitHub archive data is available through Google BigQuery. and a transformation in the data stream has occurred here. The live data we saw in the web browser was first archived in GitHub archive, and now appears back in a browser, in a web browser, which is now looking at Google BigQuery. This is a screenshot of just a web browser. But again, what we see here is just a small slice of something that has several 100 million rows like that. So the web browser doesn't really offer a way to look at it, but Google BigQuery is a way to begin to search it. Well, what happens then? So people can begin to search the GitHub data stream in terms of particular concerns. So for instance, if you're trying to look at how has cloud computing developed in GitHub over the last 5 years, or last 4 years, you could begin to construct queries, and this is a really elementary one, which looks for talk about cloud in the data stream. I'm not going to do anything more than that. On the basis of the archive and the reformatted data stream, stories about the data start to appear. Stories about the data which I think are quite platform specific. First of all, GitHub itself organizes data challenges. These are quite common around contemporary data streams. The data is made available in some way, and then the challenge is to do something with it. And in response to these data challenges, it's interesting to see what work people do on the formats, on the data formats. Again, the data challenges have occurred more than once, maybe annually. Again, this emphasis on what stories will be told, and the challenge to produce stories from the data, which is a challenge I'm kind of a bit susceptible to, but I'm interested in what people are doing with it, what other people are doing with it. One thing that happens is that it's hard to read this, and it's just a screenshot of what of a project called the Open Source Report Card. A use of the GitHub data stream that won prizes. It takes all the data from the archive and builds a kind of model of similarities between people who participate in GitHub. And like many kind of ranking and recommendation systems, it then offers you the chance to enter a GitHub username, and if this was live, I could put in my own name, and it would tell me people who are similar to me in terms of what kind of code they write, what kind of projects they work on, their work habits, when they do work, is it in the morning, the afternoon, on the weekend. So extensive mapping of individuals and their contributions and their participation occurs. Geographies, there's much mapping of geographies of coding work that comes out of the GitHub data stream. And again, this is really common in contemporary data streams, that people try and take a media platform and show its geographical distribution. Emotions or sentiments, and this one looks at the comments that people write when they add new code to GitHub repositories. I mean, those events, which are called commit events, when you add something to a repository, are occurring, I don't know, roughly 10,000 an hour. And there's enough kind of colloquial language in there to look for expressions of emotion, and then begin to see what kinds of coding work attracts anger or elicits anger or any other emotions. and then to end with the last one, and again symptomatic of the imaginaries around these data streams, is that one can have live synoptic or overviews of what's happening, and dashboards, I guess, are a very common kind of visual form today, is a way to engage with the liveness of data. data analysis is not something that's done in kind of leisurely separation from the platform, but the analysis of the data is increasingly embedded into the temporality of the platform. And these dashboards are one part of that. And finally, just to stand back a little bit more, the GitHub data stream has quickly become a favorite training tool for people learning to work with data. So this is just one of the kinds of books that, that make use of GitHub data to teach people who want to learn how to work with data streams. So to stand back from this, isn't everything we've been looking at here, beginning with the simple kind of graphics produced by GitHub itself, or through these projects that take up the archives and use the cloud computing tools like Google BigQuery, is there anything kind of surprising to us here? Is there anything here that would have the kind of the apprehensions of depth that we associate with ethnographic work? Don't a lot of these, I mean, my feeling is that a lot of these data analytic devices effectively reduce the depth of the data stream to a known set of differences, like differences and similarities between individuals, or geographies of code. You would expect there to be a lot of code development in the west coast of the US. Or the live dashboards, which kind of tell the story of growth, which are always about kind of trying to show that things are increasing. Or, if not increasing, you want to know why. So, more generally, these analyses of the data stream seem to more likely validate GitHub's own stories and their own counts of there being 13 million repositories and them being the biggest code repository on the planet. As an alternative to what I think is somewhat reductive in these ways of working with the data stream, I want to suggest some ways in which we might work against the formatting of the data. And the one possibility, the main possibility I focus on here is thinking about the role of names in the data stream. What if we paid attention to the names? And some of them you might have seen in that formatted data I showed you to begin with. Every repository, for instance, has a name. What could we learn from names and how things are named on GitHub? Well, here I want to draw a little bit on some real, quite, well, 20 years old work, maybe almost 20 years old work from Judith Butler, which talks about the conditions of naming. And try to bring that together with the device-specific focus that I've been advocating. I won't do too much with the Judith Butler, but I'll just highlight a couple of points in this quote here, which is actually quite complicated in many ways. I think what's important here is that names involve a mode of address, and naming kind of can occur in different modes of address. Some naming is kind of much more power-laden than others. Some forms of naming are much more valuable than others. And I guess those aspects of value are reflected here in Butler's talk of coinage. Coinage which kind of has a value sense as well as a linguistic sense. I also want to point out that there is some recent work in STS that I came across too, which I think is highlighting the desirability of focusing on names and the flow of names in collectives from Gisli Paulsen, which is coming out this year, I think. Butler then asks us to think about the general conditions of naming in terms of acts of offering or imposing or giving, and in terms of modes of address, and in terms of forms of value. So here's just a really brief sample of some names from GitHub. you can see that they're both generic kind of names and proper names mixing here. There are different degrees of properness or ownership in these names. Some bits of the names refer to well-known platforms and devices such as Google or Facebook. Sometimes the names are referring to practices or techniques or such as Perl or mining or monitoring. And sometimes there's personal or organizational names here as well. Sometimes names are incredibly kind of distorting. Like on GitHub, there's an enormous number of names to do with corrugated box machines, which are cardboard kind of making machines, which I think are to do with those names, and there are lots of these names that are hard to decipher, are unlikely to kind of shed, or unlikely to do the kind of things that I'm talking about. However, the fact that they exist here is quite important because it suggests forms of practice with names that are working in different modes of address. I'm largely leaving aside those kind of difficult to understand names to look at the names that are easier to understand in the data stream. A second important feature of the names on GitHub is the huge weight of imitation or citation occurring. Unique names are definitely not in the majority here. Of the 13.2 million repository names, there are 5 million that are distinct. 4.5 million repo names are direct copies or citations of others. And there are many names that are only slight variations on each other. So this suggests then that if we start thinking about the copying of names as part of the data stream, as what's occurring in the data stream, we should be thinking about processes of imitation. Tracking what is imitated might say quite a lot about what's happening on the platform, and it may say quite a lot more than just counting the number of repositories or counting the number of users. What I want to suggest is happening with this copying of names is kind of in this quote at the bottom, which comes from the philosopher Moira Gatens and Genevieve Lloyd, when they suggest that incorporation into collectives involves affective imitation. So what I'm saying is when repository names are copied or imitated, people are not only copying code, and that happens a lot, but they're participating in a process of affective imitation. That's a process of incorporation into a collective. The simple act of copying a name by either forking a repository or forking a repository is copying the whole repository over into your space. These are kind of like points of incorporation. They attract different amounts of time and effort. Sometimes people just copy something and don't really do much anymore. Other times, that copy takes on a life of its own. So this graphic, which comes from the totality of the GitHub data that we have access to, begins to show some of this. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but what I want to show you is that on the left is a huge number of repositories that have very few events in them. That is, somebody makes a repository, they name it, and they may bring it into existence simply by forking an existing repository, that is, copying it over. And those repositories really constitute a huge proportion of the GitHub 13.2 million repositories. So this copying or imitating process generates the high counts, the high repository counts. In the middle, there's a set of repositories that have maybe up to 100 events in them. And then you have some repositories out here that have thousands of events occurring in them. So that diagram, which kind of shows you that distribution of names, suggests that incorporation into collectives, the ways in which people identify with collectives through their naming practice, is occurring kind of in a huge kind of flow of quite ephemeral events where people just fork something and don't do much more with it. And then occasionally there are kind of much more centralized and long duration patterns of events on this side. We might think about this, this flow of names in terms of what Andrew Barry and Nigel Thrift kind of call passionate imitation. They're drawing, this is in their account of Gabriel Tard's work. And you know, they advocate, as has Bruno Latour and Lepine, the importance of imitation as a way of understanding social life and the limits of the forms of analysis which confine themselves to inscription and representation. So what I'm suggesting here is then that the flow of names might allow us to conduct analysis of the variations in style, affective identification that are occurring within the data stream. The second thing that the attention to names might do is begin to differentiate the whole platform aggregate into more domains. All the uses of data that I showed you from the data challenges or from GitHub itself really don't attempt to distinguish anything about what software is being developed for. It's almost as if, I mean, on the one hand, the claim is that software is the most vital kind of object in contemporary technological innovation. If you're not doing software, you're not doing technology. But on the other hand, all those uses of the data made no attempt to say, where is software being developed, for what? Where are the patterns of activity around the development of software? Are people concentrating on servers? Are they working on web front ends? Are they working on graphics? Are they working on data analytics? None of that was present there. And it's because the format of the data stream itself offers no help with that at all. As kind of social scientists or humanities researchers, the domain of what we study is incredibly important to us, and the data format affords nothing on that. It's only something like the unformatted characters, attributes of the data, such as names, that begin to show us something of that. What I've done here with this graphic, how did I come up with those classifications? And they're a bit opaque. I don't want to work through them in detail, but if you try and look at names in terms of what are the points of identification that constitute the name, and this involves just running lots and lots of searches against the archived data, looking for particular terms, you can begin to see where coding effort is, where the work being done on code lies. So a huge amount of work in code is about editing it. That's why the category editor here is the biggest. Much of what the software developers do on GitHub is kind of play around with different ways of editing code. So you can count the names that relate, that link repositories to different domains by using these lots of repeated queries to kind of map out a namespace in the data stream. So to show you that in a little more detail, for instance, this is the kind of queries that are running against BigQuery that kind of combine huge numbers of possible terms that relate to social media in this case, to show which repositories have some kind of attachment to social media platforms, such as Wikipedia, LinkedIn, Twitter, so forth. And those queries kind of lead to lots of repo names that have some connection to the particular domain, in this case, social media itself. But, as you can even see in those examples, sorry, I want to the next one. The domains themselves aren't separate at all. These domains are the kind of product of, well, I guess my attempts to kind of differentiate bits of software. But the domains themselves overlap with each other. And this kind of heat map diagram begins to show you that, well, there are intersections and hotspots of intersection between different kinds of coding work going on that we see in the data stream. The final thing I want to show you here, and the title here says that the unstable trajectories in the namespace, it's not as if these queries, these ways of working with the data stream produce stable, kind of verifiable results. My experience is actually that the queries constantly produce different results as you reshape the queries. So rather than this being like a data analytic dashboard that tells you what is happening in the data stream, it's much more a way of kind of moving backwards and forwards in the data stream. And if you compare this graph with the previous version I had up here, now tests are much bigger. As my queries around tests, kind of testing is this important thing in software development, and a lot of people just do things with tests in GitHub. As my queries kind of around testing were refined, then a lot more queries, a lot more repositories concerned with testing appeared. So these graphs are not meant to represent kind of definitive accounts of what's happening on GitHub, but rather as the moments of apprehension that I spoke about earlier. The final thing I want to say about the device-specific nature of this. On the one hand, GitHub is a platform, and it has its specificities. What complicates it slightly is that it's a platform on which people develop lots of devices. It's a platform for developing devices. And the experience of working with the data stream format means you are constantly displacing the devices that you use in the social research in various ways. And for instance, I've just put this up because I used BigQuery, but I also used other database projects that are on GitHub itself to try and work with the GitHub data stream. And I think this, this is an important part of it, that the social research itself has its own device-specific features, and it does its own forms of affective imitation. In this case, using Redis is a database that a lot of people are using at the moment. So to stand back from what I've been saying, what does this kind of work try to do? Well, for one thing, I've been trying to avoid repeating GitHub's own mantra, which is their story is our story. That's what GitHub says about its data stream. The stories told from the data reflect on the centrality of GitHub to code development. In that sense, the stories repeat the platform's own formatting of the data stream. And again, GitHub says there are countless stories to tell. And I think those stories, as they kind of appear through the data challenges or through GitHub's own data graphics, tend to mirror the platform itself more. I've been suggesting instead that we should think about the data stream more and those aspects of the format that are kind of less formatted in the data stream. And just to contextualize this, well, one thing that's been at the back of what I've been saying is Latour, Jensen, and Venturina's recent work from 2012 on working with data, which I kind of broadly agree with in many ways. But I think what their formulation misses out is this question of how the data is pre-formatted to tell particular stories for particular actors or agents. They talk about the data leaving traces, the actions of the agents leaving traces that produces a rich data set. But the question of formatting isn't in there. In contrast, from Helen Varan and her idea that if you want to work practically with numbers, you have to make them work and you have to do work to make the numbers work, has been important to me. And one thing that I think I've been trying to do a little bit is do something she does, which is moved from numbers that are about showing how the many can all be summarized into one towards an account which shows that numbers can give you apprehensions of wholes. Numbers are part views on wholes, vaguely defined wholes. For Maris and Veldfreda, the idea that one should think about the kind of work you need to do on data formats in order to heighten kind of tensions or ambivalences between what's device-specific and what overflows the devices. In a particular way, I've been trying to do that, and it's, I mean, in some ways incredibly crude, but I also find dynamic in the sense that Maris talks about, is to look at the imitation, the passionate imitation of names in the data. And at times, I think we might, through that, begin to enter into a kind of more space of ambiguity or indeterminacy, and to encounter the momentary apprehensions of death, not of death, of death. There's a form of death there too, in the data stream.
Now we have the time. We have the time. This one is not working. Okay, we have the time for a few questions, and you are very welcome. I will try to make this work, and if not, you have to shout very loudly to make it work. This one is not working. So, any questions? Torben, can you start? You are the good shepherd. Cheerleader, you start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very exciting talk, and it's really interesting material. And the way I understand your project, you're sort of struggling with how to come to terms with this strange phenomenon and what kind of ontologies to look for. And my question is can you imagine some sort of things that you would, or kinds of explanations that you could develop? Is there anything? Can you raise questions such as why did this happen in this way, or how can we explain how this platform came into being, or the effects of it? Or because to me it seems like you're struggling with how to talk about the phenomenon, but that's really valid work and important and difficult struggle to find the right terms to engage with this. But I wonder if out of this comes some sort of explanatory projects of some sort. Is there
You mean like an explanation of a particular, like why there's a thing like GitHub as opposed to...
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of sort of the old habits of STS would be to say, okay, how did this effect come into being, or how did this machine become stable or unstable, or how did this particular viewpoint become marginalized within this format and so on. So
it's a good question. It takes me back to using the kind of the well-established tools of STS, social constructive technology, vector network theory. One of those things. You could definitely account for the ways in which this platform is, the way this platform is set up and why it's doing certain things, why it's publishing a data stream, or why it offers particular kind of tools or affordances to people who use it. And certainly with an ANT style approach, you would be able to look at the ways in which they enroll people and the way in which they translate interests in order to kind of augment the platform and, to increase the hubness of GitHub, I think. And some of my stories are about that. And I think when I was talking about how people use the data archives and the data stream to tell stories, they're kind of the kinds of stories that the STS established approaches in STS would allow you to understand. You would see, oh, why do people do all this? They get a huge data stream and then they use it to look at individual practices. In a way, I think you could give a good STS account of that. Where it would begin to struggle, I think, is with the much more open question of which, Katja put on the table for this conference, which is about how do you imagine transformations in ways of working with technologies or sciences or various situations in which our kind of work is transformed. Obviously the overarching thing here is, the overarching scenario is what's happening with data. And I haven't talked big data at all or anything like that, but all of this stuff is part of a ferment of activity around data. And STS actually has a long-standing set of kind of quite subterranean practices around data. ANT work, a lot of that was quite scientometric and it used bibliographic databases effectively. People like Latour and John Law were doing hypercard stacks, in the early 80s, where they were trying to use software to think about networks. I think people today, in certain parts of STS, and I guess this is the digital STS thing, are trying to think too, well, what will we do in response to these data streams? In what ways will our ways of thinking, our ontological kind of practices, as well as the kind of down-to-earth practices of what we do as we do our work, how will they shift in response to these data streams and formats and archives? And that's a much more open-ended and political. I think Helen Brand's statement here about getting numbers to work is a politics is really important here. What I think I'm trying to do is kind of challenge those numbers, the 13.2 million number, and say the story that tells is not just about GitHub's centrality. It's a much different story. It's a story that we could reanimate in much more kind of evocative and resonant ways if we begin to work with those numbers seriously to kind of pluralize them, to turn them into pluralities, not unities which all point back to the centrality of the platform GitHub. Yeah. Struggling to get an answer.
Okay, Adrian, now it has initiated 4 questions, so I think we will take these questions and then that will be the end before the break. And the first one is Jesper Simonsen.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. You opened your presentation by mentioning that it was an investigation that you described as an ethnography into the data stream. And as I understand the data stream, it's the code from programmers around the world. So the data stream does not actually represent any data from the users of the applications, but from those that program the applications. So I wonder if you could characterize the type of knowledge from this culture or community of programmers that you think you can derive from this data stream and contrast it to, for example, other types of ethnographic analysis, like, for example, Sherry Turkle's analysis of second self users or something like that. It must be very different types of insights you get.
Yeah, well here programmers are users, because the programmers are users of the social media platform GitHub. So it's not as if programmers are privileged agents here. The programmers are themselves kind of seen as social media participants, and coding work is their social practice. It's a slight shift, a recursive kind of shift, because if coding work, if making of technology is a social practice overtly, that's something that STS has kind of said for a long time, that making technology is a social practice. Platforms like GitHub make that sociality of technical practice their business model. They turn coding into a social media practice. So the split between design and the centers of innovation, or making of technology, and the users, which are somewhere out in different domains or worlds, in this case is kind of messed up in a way, because making code or making software is itself the cultural or social side. So I think in that case, the ethnography is like a laboratory ethnography, in the sense that we study what scientists or engineers or doctors are doing, but in this case, they're not in a special place because coding has become social in this social media sense. Does that make sense? But it doesn't answer the... I'll have to talk to you later. Sorry.
And then we have a question from Rachel.
Hi, Adrian. Thank you, I enjoyed that. You started near the beginning of your talk by talking about paying attention to format. I entirely agree. I think it's very important, and having worked with Annelies Rals's work, she pays a lot of attention to form. But nearer the end of your talk, you were seeming to suggest that we need to look for things that are less formatted, or stories that are outside format. So I was wondering what the scope of your idea of format was, and in your material, what came outside of it.
Yeah. Well, I guess I see format here, kind of probably not in as sophisticated a way as Annelies Ralls does, I would say. My take on format is kind of what is given to you in the data stream as something that you can work with without too much effort, because the format is doing it for you already. So those kind of complicated bracketed bits of data I was showing you earlier, I mean, are meant to allow particular attributes or links or names to be quickly extracted. That's the purpose of the format in the data stream. I'm kind of thinking here, I have drawn, and I didn't reference it properly a bit, on an article by Rick Ross Dintertype and Helen Varan, which is kind of talks about disfiguring moments and or disfiguring kind of or blurred objects that kind of lie across things. I won't talk about it too much in detail, but I was kind of looking for what in the format is kind of not figured neatly, what begins to blur across lines and can't be captured neatly by the format. So Annelies Ralls stuff is more about kind of how formats recursively kind of reflect on themselves in a way. And I have tried to work with the recursion notion in this stuff to say that, well, we can see the format is itself telling a story about how the format came to be. But that recursion I find less satisfactory than trying to look for the tensions between what's formatted and what resists formatting. I suppose that would be the way to differentiate it there.
And then we have a question from Anders Brock.
If you can make this work, yeah, it's okay. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I guess my question has exactly to do with this kind of recursivity, not so much the one you just talked about, but between the sort of data analytical practices in the field, if you like, and the STS data analytical practices. I think this is very interesting. As you said, there's a discussion on this, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more from the point of view of your specific device-specific study here, how you would put your study into that discussion on digital devices in STS. I'm thinking here, for instance, on some of the points that Maras and Velterwede make in their argument, right, on live social research, where they say that embedded in this is a sort of historicity. So it's not just the liveness of the data, it's the ability to track, if you like, what kinds of issues or concerns, or perhaps in your terminology, the sort of imitations are happening at any particular point in time. I wonder if you could sort of position what you are doing in this particular format of data practices within that sort of wider discussion on live social research.
Yeah, I'll be honest and say that I haven't managed to kind of, I think Norche is kind of ahead of me on this stuff in many ways. So when she opens up this space about the work needed to move between what's there in the format and the kind of the concerns of social research, and she talks about heightening the ambivalence. I think that's what I'm trying to do before as well. I guess where I maybe have got a few different things to say is that because I'm working on this area of software development, coding, where making devices is the concern, and all these repositories on the GitHub platform are all about making devices. So there's a kind of extra level of kind of recursion there, which I don't know quite what to do with. Practically, I get sucked into it because my work is on GitHub. You can find these analyses and the data and the code used to do these analyses on GitHub. I'm using other devices on GitHub to help me do the analysis. And at the same time, I'm trying to work with the GitHub data stream in the way that Maris is describing. So there's a few too many levels of recursion to kind of pull apart there, which is why I don't want to go down the recursive direction too much, because I think I'll just end up saying it's all recursive. Where does that leave you? I mean, I've been talking with colleagues at ITU about where to go with recursion. The problem is recursion has this thing about it can keep going. And as a methodological move, it's nice. I like the aesthetics of recursion. I like the fact that I am making stuff that becomes part of the object I'm analysing in a very practical sense. My code is in a repository on GitHub. And the things that we've done with the GitHub have attracted attention from people on GitHub because we put them on the blog and then they look back at them and people have said, oh, that's because of this or whatever. So there is a lot of kind of looping going on. It's a very loopy space. But are the aesthetics of looping what we want to do? That's the question for me. Looping is nice. The people on GitHub loop all the time. They kind of, it's a common thing around code development that you kind of work on your own space in a way recursively. I don't know whether that's a good way for STS to get really recursive.
Thank you, Adrian. That was the final question, and that is nearly on time. So I invite you all to say thank you. Thank you, Adrian. You have coffee and fruit outside, and please, I think all the sessions after the break are in this building, so you can only get lost in this building.